I watched him in court. One of Haynes' amazing qualities was his voice. His voice had the broadest range of notes of any lawyer that I ever heard examine a witness or argue a case. His voice was melodious, almost as if he was singing. The harmony, rhythm, and tempo of his voice could literally hypnotize a jury. Richard was a virtuoso with words. He could speak softly and bring a jury up to the edge of their seats and then boom them back against the back of their chairs. He could make a gesture with his hand pointing away to his left or right, and every head on the jury would shift in unison like a synchronized flock of birds. Not only a truly amazing lawyer and fine man, he was a true gentleman, very pleasant and friendly with a tremendous wit. He would never make an off-color statement in the presence of a woman and was not given to profanity. The memorial service was a truly grand tribute to Richard Racehorse Haynes, who was characterized as being fearless. The fact that Racehorse was a workhorse was underscored, emphasizing his long hours and tremendous study of the facts. I recall when Haynes tried the first DNA case in Texas on which he secured a not guilty after spending countless days at the Rice Library mastering the topic of DNA. Haynes' cross-examination is legendary. It was said at the service that he once had a records custodian who was ordinarily only asked 5 questions on the stand for 3 days. My recollection is that Richard had 38 or 39 consecutive DWI acquittals until he lost one. However, I have heard a much larger number. The true number is lost in time. Regardless, whatever the number was, it remains a gate record. Richard once shared with me that he mastered the art of cross-examination trying DWI cases, back before video recorders, breathalyzers, and blood tests. First, Haynes would always go to the scene. He would photograph and diagram all of the specific landmarks. All patrols were a team of 2 officers. Richard explained how he would go into every little detail with the first officer about every step of the arrest. No detail was too small. He would inquire when the officer first observed the vehicle, how far the vehicle traveled, what the driver was doing, how the officer approached the vehicle, every single statement by the officer and the defendant, every little move, what the other officer was doing, every gesture and declaration, movement, and approach by the other officer. He was like a Swiss watchmaker building a precision timepiece. Haynes would then get the other officer in the courtroom and take the other officer through the same detailed examination. Inevitably, there would be numerous variances between the testimony of the 2 officers. Haynes then was able to capitalize on these inconsistencies and create doubt regarding the officer's credibility concerning the defendant's intoxication. Richard Racehorse Haynes, in my opinion, simply the greatest trial lawyer in Houston and in Texas, has set a very high bar. In college at the University of Houston, Richard, my dad, and a few others created a week-long musical and comedy review. The Frontier Fiesta still goes on today. My dad told me that during the shows, Richard would walk out on the stage and interrupt the program. He would holler, "Script," and from the rafters, someone would lower a roll of toilet paper. Richard would tear off a few squares and start into some of the funniest stand-up comedy he had ever heard. A few years later, another lady brought in her clock radio that she was convinced the government was sending her messages through and controlling her mind. She asked Richard to take care of it for her. Richard told her he would be happy to help. He instructed her to leave the HAL clock radio with him and to come back the following day. As soon as she left, he took out a Post-it note and wrote "debugged" on it and stuck the note to the front of clock radio. The next day, when she came back, Richard gave her the clock radio and told her it had been debugged. She said, thank you, you saved me." She left consoled and happy. Richard Haynes' life can best be boiled down to a simple phrase: a life of service. Richard twice suited up for his country. He twice defended the principles of freedom. During the height of World War II, at 17, he joined the Marines and fought at Iwo Jima. During the Korean War, he went back in and trained paratroopers. His life of service continued as a criminal lawyer. He spent the next 50 years committed to protecting the principles of freedom. He spent his life looking the government in the eye and saying, "Prove it." Representing the criminally accused, those that the public believes are the worst society has to offer, is a daunting task. Richard believed, as do I, that if the Constitution cannot work for the worst we have, it will not work for anyone. Richard stood up for the core values of our country and believed that standing up for the freedoms embodied in our Bill of Rights is an absolute necessity. His life was a life dedicated to service to the public, service to our Constitution. I asked Racehorse a lot about the John Hill case. By then, the case was 40 years old, but it didn't matter. His memory of the details of the case was extraordinary. I once asked if it was possible that John Hill had faked his own death and gotten away to Mexico, as had been suggested in one of the movies. Racehorse laughed and replied, "If John Hill had managed to do that, he would have to be the toughest guy who ever lived." I asked why, to which he responded, "Because I saw his autopsy." One evening, after enjoying libations with friends, he was driving home down Memorial Drive. He got pulled over by HPD. By then, he was well known to HPD, so they were happy to have him. He was extremely athletic, and he knew his capabilities. The cop was going to arrest him for driving while intoxicated, so he asked the cop if he would let him go if he could successfully do a backflip off his back bumper. The cop readily agreed, assuming that he would land face down smack in the middle of the road. A couple other officers came by to watch the show. This was perfect, as he loved an audience. He climbed up on his back bumper and did a perfect backflip, spiking the landing like an Olympic champion. The startled cops had to let him go, and the legend had beat the cops once again. Racehorse ended the story by pointing out the cops didn't realize that he always did the backflip better when he was inebriated. He told me a story about when they first moved into River Oaks. He was out in the yard wearing coveralls, thinking he probably looked like a yardman. While out front, he said a River Oaks matron came out of her house and waved him over. He approached the woman and she asked, "Boy, what are these Haynes people like?" Racehorse had a lot of fun with this. He told the woman that Mr. Haynes is a gem of a fellow, but that Mrs. Haynes is a shrew of a woman. About 2 weeks later, he and Mrs. Haynes were at a black tie event at the River Oaks Country Club, and the River Oaks matron was seated directly across from them. She had a mortified look and never waved him over again. I recall asking him about Iwo Jima. He had a distant look, and I could see his mind was a million miles away. He confirmed that he had saved a man's life. The man was stuck on the beach under fire, and Racehorse had cleared the beach and had good cover. He saw the other soldier stuck out on the beach, pinned down under fire. He left his relatively secure spot, ran back out on the beach under fire, and saved the soldier. I asked him if he knew the soldier he saved, and he did not. For me, the Iwo Jima story fairly well sums up who Racehorse was. He was an extraordinarily brave man who would risk everything to save another man's life. He spent his life saving other men and women's lives. He was the best lawyer I ever knew. He was my hero and my friend. The more I came to know Racehorse, the more I admired him. Racehorse could be tough as hell inside the courtroom, but outside he was as kind as a man could be. When we were trying the case in Louisiana that I was telling you about, we were representing a state district judge and the district attorney who were charged with buying votes in a rural Louisiana parish, being tried in federal court. We ended up getting one of the cases dismissed and the jury acquitted on the other one. So we had a victory party there, and the supporters that supported the judge and the district attorney literally rented the local country club. They only had our party in there that night, and they asked Haynes what kind of music he liked. He said he liked country western, so they hired a 4-piece country western band. Richard Racehorse Haynes was the last of the old-school criminal defense lawyers. The tools of his trade were a Mont Blanc pen, a legal pad, and a steel trap for a brain. He did not need computers, electronic gadgets, or gimmickry to convey his message to juries. All he needed was words. What made Racehorse run? Was it that he grew up poor on the wrong side of the tracks? Was it that he felt that the powers that be did not accept him, so he needed to call attention to himself in any way possible? We will never know the answer. What we do know is that 3 generations of clients benefited from his burning desire to prove that he was the best lawyer in America. Richard understood what makes a criminal defense lawyer great. He stood his ground and did not back down. He believed that it is better to die on your feet than to live on your knees. He was willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause, and he did all of it fearlessly, without regret. I heard about what Richard could do long before I saw it myself. I did not have to be sold on him. His legend had sold itself. That was the way it was once, when word of mouth was gospel. That was the source of the joy I will always feel. The joy that I had the gift of practicing law with Richard when he was in his prime. The last time I saw Richard at the courthouse, he was walking at a 45-degree angle to the ground, his briefcase dragging behind him and almost toppling him over. I thought that he had stayed too long, that he did not know when to quit. I failed to appreciate that for Richard. Continuing to work when he could barely stand was his statement that he would not go gently into that good night, that he would rage against the dying of the light.